Hello Internet, my name is Clappy and welcome to the Fandom Studies, the first part in a series of many questions asking what it means to be a furry and what does science have to do with any of this. You may think that as we have spent so much time examining the history of art and the furry fandom has only existed for 40 something years, that we would have a really good time at understanding them by now. But that reality is far from existence. Still, that hasn't discouraged a medley of writers from attempting to categorize the fandom, each to their own varying degrees of success. The term furry wouldn't be functionalized until 1986, originally going under the moniker of funny animal enthusiasts, without any intention for academic use or the cascading effect into what we would eventually call the entire fandom, sparked from a rebranded room party set up by fandom historians Mark Molino and Rod O'Reilly, accredited to their friend and unspecified non-furry known only as Dr. Pepper. Making the term loose, informal, and without proper definition. Scientific research wouldn't fall upon the fandom until the year 1998, with the first peer-reviewed study following in 2006 to be published in the first empirical paper in 2008. Scientists weren't the first to get their hands on the furry fandom, however, with a wealth of already published articles and television marking their territory by usually creating satirical and unrepresentative views of the community. Their reasons didn't spark from nothing, and there may be theories as to why furries were obfuscated from the popular appeal to begin with. A topic to be later investigated once we approach videos on furry stigma. Sticking to the confines of the early to late 2000s, as the internet began to sweep the nations, word of furries began to spread, and so too did the observable numbers and populations. Conventions during this time saw yearly increases of upwards of 30 to 40% in annual attendance, a rate only rivaled in the recent years as many flocked to the fandom during COVID-19. I was one of those furries. I joined the fandom in 2020 and have gradually spun my life around its community. In that time, I've seen many scholars and furries alike try to define the fandom. Conversely, none of these definitions ever seem to catch on among furry or outsider populations. Because, in short, there is no definition. There is no simple and agreeable format to present the furries that will be understandable to all parties. Instead, we are left with a series of distinct methods that distinguish between furries and whatever we categorize as a regular talking animal. At least one of these methods is lexical, defined by our ability to type furries into a search bar and come up with a result. We may attempt to define furries simplistically as a enthusiastic interest in anthropomorphic animals, but that lacks context on why furries exist in the way they have for so long, outliving many other fandoms that anthropomorphize robots and fruit. Where are the fruit fandoms? VeggieTales was a classic, guys! Importantly, some people who share the interest in anthropomorphic animals may not consider themselves furry. Do we have the right to label them as furry anyway? I don't think so. Clearly, as society merges with the furry fandom, their views and perspectives have contorted the core definition of furry. It takes more than a simple interest in animals to constitute the furry identity, and thus, a range of competing stipulative definitions are born. For clarity's sake, to be stipulative is to give new meaning to an existing term. This may expand or even contradict the lexical definition set out by searching the term plus meaning. Many have approached the problems of furry definition through an analytical perspective. This method allows for a given phenomenon to be broken down into its component parts, achieving a definition by analysis of properties, providing a list of attributes which comprise the particular subject. The analysis method also provides a more in-depth focus on individual aspects to a given label. This is how we come to study persona behavior, social hierarchy, or any other factors within furry culture. Occasionally, this may lead to a form of hyperfixation, or research claiming to be about furry culture that is examining another form of behavior entirely. The deconstructing of certain labels may place emphatic stress on specific behaviors as inherent to the whole. This may imply a two-way relationship where there simply isn't any, possibly stigmatizing the group if the analysis is based on negative stereotypes, misrepresenting and delegitimizing the actual term. As a less stigmatized but still relevant example, fursuiting is a commonly cited property of furry culture. However, little more than 1/3 of furries report owning a fursuit of some variety, 33.9% for online surveys, and 40.8% over the course of annual in-person surveys from 2011 to 2016. In other words, furry behavior is compositional rather than constitutional of fursuiting. Consequently, any property that is only majority and not totality will be compositional as well. The commonly cited fursona is one example. Not all furries have it, although a majority of furries do. The analysis method is not a complete definition of the furry fandom, but a structuralist analysis of various compositional parts. This can be extra beneficial in comparison cases, otherwise known as the comparison and contrast substrategy, to clearly outline similarities and differences between simple terms. How does a furry hobbyist compare to a highly identified fur? How do some furries identify closely with their fursona, whilst other furries do not? As we start to compare groups to their surrounding context, think anime or fantasy sport fans, we move into the synthesis method. This method recontextualizes properties with how they relate to the wider world, providing a more social definition instead of a strictly analytical one. Through this method, we can better examine contributing factors of community structure, stigmatization, institutional operation, etc. When defining a behavior by its surrounding context, the situation is more important than the act itself. Representation in media, pathologizing research articles, and common stereotypes are all ways that outsider influences help shape the fandom, eliciting certain behaviors and activities such as debate and in-group conflict. Synthesis methods in practice define the consequence of behavior by their societal reactions. Furries and their component properties are less constructed by individual parts than by societal reactions to them, whose existence is considered a disruption to the social norm. The theory was not made to describe furries under a stipulative definition, instead providing a method of recognizing societal reception and its role in contributing to how the label is perceived. This method is often utilized by writers to help recontextualize furries to the outside world. We will come back to this method time and time again as we compare groups and how furries separate themselves from other communities. Societal perception is how another method, the denotative method, can help create false inferences about a group. The denotative method works by considering general definitions into a series of smaller examples that comprise the whole. The benefit of such would be to minimize ambiguity by detailing every example that appears in a particular group. Furry artists, furry dancers, protogens, and fursuit makers, or harmful groups such as racist and sex offenders. But in order to provide an indication of understanding, the method must require detailing on a large majority of its adherents, making the method functionally useless at defining large communities. The exact number of furries is unknown and ever-changing. There would be no possible way to catalogue and examine all of its constituents. Meanwhile, the species of dog or number of continents is fairly easy to organise and study. Regardless, denotative methods are still commonly applied throughout modern society, utilised to enforce potentially discriminatory practices against particular groups and subcultures. If we were to examine this practice in media, we should view the representation of furry identities and communities. This may uncover a form of bias that appears when furries of a harmful stereotype are shown disproportionate to the average fur. Per this ignorance to the typical furry does not often utilize this method, instead falling upon the layperson with little contact to the furry fandom, whose views and opinions are shaped by the media they consume. Incidentally, the manufacturers of this content, those who perpetuate the certain stereotypes, are partially responsible for the collective minds of their audience. Denotative methods are not important because they are accurate, but because they are frequent and wrong. By contrast, definitions that are studied through their environmental observation, that is, within their full context rather than through a series of component parts, are utilized by fan study researchers as a way to garner more rich and authentic definitions of furry. This method allows fluidity by personal definition, granting the opportunity to analyze groups with more dimensions of meaning. It is relative to the internal elements rather than external influence, conducive to how members of the group describe themselves over anyone else. Surely if we can't define furries, then the furries can. This method is often utilized by the media through interviews and stories, a collection of perspectives used to understand a particular topic or idea. You click on a segment about furries and they ask a furry about the community. It's foolproof. However, their execution of this model and the competency to consider multiple informants is not consistent. In order to grasp a suitable definition, researchers should ask many, not few informants on their believed definition. The selected interviewee should not be ill-prepared or faced with a series of clearly loaded or biased questions. The key is authenticity. It should match the reality of those who exist within it. Still, regardless of authenticity, definitions of the term furry vary greatly between individuals. When surveyed by the International Anthropomorphic Research Project in 2021, no agreeable conceptualization of furries was unanimous above 45.2% of the population. Additionally, most furries gave responses that fell under multiple themes, suggesting that furries hold a multifaceted view of what it means to be a furry, mostly circulating a sense of community, followed by an interest in anthropomorphic animals, then a source of inspiration or self-expression. Following this thought, furry may appear to exist in the space between others, through the interactions that form their social identity. Describing furry as the foundation to build relationships, those infeasible to certain populations. Despite the apparent importance of community engagement, importance is better adequate to explain values rather than definitions. Community may be better understood as a byproduct rather than representation of the label itself. Whether community is inextricably tied to the furry identity or not, community certainly facilitates many furry identities, so its importance to the definition should not be disregarded. So, if furries cannot unanimously decide on a description, then it must be conducive to however the individual perceives that label. This is how you get the phrase furries are only furries if they want to be. In practice, we achieve a form of tautology, whereby the self-prescribed label of furries will always conclude in a true statement. The legitimacy of furry is conditional to the individual's use. This forms the implication that if self-described as a furry, they must be considered a furry, and if not self-described as a furry, they must not be considered a furry. If all definitions under the implicative methodology are tautologies, then this diminishes the quality of the term furry as a functional description. Anything can be a furry if we choose it to be. It is easy to understand how this perspective can lead to what's called an ostensive definition. That is, we are able to convey meaning by providing examples, pointing towards a concept and saying, that is a furry. The lack of ability to communicate tangible definitions, but insistence that everyone has some intuitive understanding. That personal experience provides authority to label furries by observation. But this, as I've said, speaks little to what actually is contained within that community. Taken simply, the furry fandom often evades simple definition. Is there a way to describe the furry fandom? There are many. It is a wildly complex question that involves many schools of thought and diverges between every person you talk to. Later in this series, we will explore other disciplines such as post-humanist theory, which explores intersections between the human, the non-human, and the post-human worlds. And we will continue down the line of cultural studies and fan studies. Today's definition of a furry is not one that is boiled down to a quotable phrase, but one that pulls on all these different schools of thought. Furry, like its broadening psychological perspective, is an integrative science. All of these methods interact and comprise our understanding of furry. Even denotative definitions find their use within pockets of our community. The only way to understand further is to ask more questions. I'll see you next episode. Before we end this video, a massive appreciation to those who have supported me through Patreon and YouTube memberships. A special thank you to our highest tier Patreon Zephyr for their generous support, and an extended thank you to both our Super Seals and Seal tier Patreons as well. To have your name in the credits and get to see uploads a week early, there is a link in the description alongside all my other social medias. This is not a compulsory action, please take care of yourself before any YouTuber tells you to, but for now, I'll see you losers in the next video. Peace.